So, welcome to another edition of Feature Fridays. My name is Guy Bartram. I'm Product Marketing Director for Cloud Director Suite. And today I'm joined again with Jörg. Jörg, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Jörg Lev. I work as a technical product manager in VMware's Cloud Services business unit.
Thanks, Jörg. And today we're going to be discussing a very important aspect of Cloud Director, which is how to run services and what type of services you can run on Cloud Director. We've done a lot of demos in the last few series, a few episodes in the series regarding what Cloud Director can do in terms of extensibility and in terms of capability. But this week we wanted just to kind of talk through some aspects of, out-the-box services, running additional managed services, and how that could be done from a fairly high-level kind of standpoint, and run through all of that and all of the aspects of managed services.
Yeah, that's the plan for today's session, to really give you an idea about the different questions you have to ask when you design such managed service offerings, what the different, how these different aspects map to VCD functionality or to the additional add-on solutions that we have in our platform.
Yeah. And it's become more and more important over the last 2 years, I think, to really start focusing on broader portfolio of services and to have more sticky services for your customers. The analysts are certainly saying that customers you'll see less attrition of customers and less excessive discounting if you're providing more diverse services, and VCD is the platform for that, right? We've shown clearly how VCD can do that. And now let's dive into, like you say, the features and functions of VCD that underpin those services and how you can start looking at them.
Yeah, and that's one very important aspect of today's session as well, that we are not discussing one prescriptive solution, how you design such a service offering, and that's the only way how to do that as a managed service provider. But we really want to give you all these different design questions, the requirements that you have to keep in mind, and the different actual choices and design decisions that you can make when you design managed services and put them on our VCD platform. So at the end of today's sessions, you won't get any out-of-the-box solution how to implement such managed service offerings, but we want to give you the toolbox with all the different design decisions that you can make when designing these services and letting the tenants use them in a VCD environment.
Okay. So I guess we start with, the baseline services, right, which are the out-of-the-box virtual data center services, VM services, etc., and build on that as the starting blocks, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's the plan, of course. When you use Cloud Director, Cloud Director already provides a lot of functionality out of the box for infrastructure as a service offerings. So as a service provider, you can create these organization VDCs with different allocation models and offer them to your tenants, and the tenant can use the tenant portal to self-service consume this capacity, so they can deploy VMs and VApps with a lot of functionality when it comes to network automation. They can do self-service firewall, load balancer, additional network services, and have a lot of flexibility how to how they want to connect the virtual machines. And all the consumption can be done, of course, through the portal from a human user through the user interface in the browser. But we already discussed that VCD also provides a fully blown set of APIs that enables a tenant user really to consume that in a more automated fashion. And then you can place tools like Terraform or vRealize Orchestrator on top of that to make it even more comfortable, or to create some more powerful automation around that.
Let's just think about that for a second, because I think this is glossed over a lot, and I really want to kind of point it out. When we're looking at infrastructure as a service, and Cloud Director is kind of the king in that area, providing multi-tenancy services to your tenants. Now, one of the key things I think is when you compare that to what you would get from an Azure or an AWS or a Google Cloud, is you have the ability to provide a flex-based VM, for example, so you can specify a t-shirt size, just like the hyperscalers do, right? I mean, they've got hundreds of different varieties of t-shirt size VMs. But then you've also got the ability to provide a kind of a resource pool where customers can spin up VMs of any size they choose. I mean, they have all a pool of resources to just draw upon as they wish. And that's something you don't get in a hyperscale environment. You don't get that capacity pool capability. And I think that's really a big differentiator when you're looking at what type of service to provide. Some customers will appreciate the t-shirt size, take the complexity away from the decision, and others will prefer actually having a pool of resource that they can draw on. And then obviously you've got the great aspects like placement policies and all of that sort of stuff to kind of really help the tenants keep the workload in the correct execution venue, whether that be on a host logically with its application or database from a licensing perspective, for example. All of these are real sort of key differentiators and capabilities in just the base IaaS platform. And we haven't even talked about out-of-the-box networking and security, which is obviously a big differentiator as well.
Yeah, that's a very important aspect, because that these different capabilities with the allocation models, storage profiles, and the whole network architecture and possibilities that you as a provider and the tenant have in VCD, that gives you a whole bunch of new options when you want to design and offer these add-on services, because you don't need to have one central instance or a shared instance where you create some tenancy for the application on one VM that you as a provider manage. But there are different options available where you really create, you define a managed service where you as the provider care about the backups and the different things we will see later on our whiteboard session. But actually the VMs or the infrastructure where this service is running on is placed into the org VDC of the tenant. So as a provider, you can use all the different flexibility when it comes to these allocation models, the network separation, and so on. You get the multi-tenancy and the security and isolation out of the box. And as a tenant user, you can, I get all the functionality to define or to connect these managed services that I get from the provider, where I don't need to care about the underlying operating system. I want to just consume, I don't know, a web shop platform or a content management system, but I still want to be able or need to connect that to some other virtual machine, whereas my proprietary application is running, and I want to, just connect them within my org VDC boundaries, for example.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start then. Let's get onto the whiteboard and look at how those core infrastructure foundations, if you like, are the building blocks for the additional services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let me share my whiteboard session here. Okay, so you should be able to see now a rather pretty empty whiteboard so far. Yeah, so one thing when we care about or talk about managed service design, it's always this small line that we can see here that separates provider and tenant responsibilities. So whenever we care about and talk about managed services, that's your decision as a provider to make how much work I want to do as a provider and how much work can I do because I know the application and I have the application knowledge, versus what can the tenant consume and how far or how standardized you can make these offerings. So there's always that separation between provider concerns and tenant self-service capabilities. And that's something that we will see will sort of, has to be discussed and kept in mind for all the different points.
Yeah, I think in that you got to be aware that we don't want to be, or no cloud provider wants to be providing customized services. We want to be able to personalize so the tenant thinks they're getting something that's fairly unique to them, but customization is complexity and will kill your OpEx model. So avoid that at all cost.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. So when we have a look at the different requirements from a provider perspective and from a tenant perspective, I want to have a service that fits my needs in terms of functionality, in terms of, I don't know, versions of a different database offering or a different type of e-commerce system that I use, or I don't know, a content management system like WordPress, where I want to develop my application and my content or post my content on. I want to have that as easy as consume as possible, because that enables me to not really care about any of the deployment process. And of course, it should be effortless to operate. So in the best case, since I'm paying for a managed service, I don't want to care about any day two operations. Perhaps I want to get notified and have some ways to schedule bigger upgrades that will need some testing on an application perspective. But for the day-to-day backup patches, security patches, operating system patches, and so on, I don't want to care about that. On the other hand, as a provider, of course, as you mentioned already, you need to look into get some economy of scale in terms of should be self-service deployment from the tenant, so that you don't have to do any manual operations for the initial deployment. And then, of course, for the day two operations and the ongoing operations of the service, you want to have some scale effects in there, so that it does not matter if you have one tenant consuming the same service or 10 or even hundreds of tenants. It should be the same effort for you as a provider to do these operations, because that's where you can get these scaling effects and increase your margin.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, having in mind these different requirements, we can now have a look at the different steps. So on the bottom of the whiteboard, we can see these different stages that typically are in the life cycle of such a managed service. So the preparation, where you as a service provider define the actual service offering, the functionality, and the template and the versions of certain products that you want to offer. Then eventually that service gets deployed either by a tenant in a completely self-service fashion, or just by them sending an email or a request or some order form to your operation teams, and then the service provider operation teams deploy that. And then there's the big thing, while that the service is up and running, you have a whole set of tasks for the regular day two operations and for the operations. And then eventually, of course, the service is going to be decommissioned. Now let's start with the preparation. That's where you typically come in with the template definition. So you define your VM or VApp templates that you want to offer to the tenants, and then you have for the deployment these different options that we already discussed with the org VDCs, where you deploy these virtual machines into in a Cloud Director environment. And now there are different options which org VDC you want to deploy such a managed service VM, or a VM that runs a managed service. You can do that either when we talk about the bottom level, that would be a special org VDC that's really managed by the provider, and where the tenant does not have any access, or perhaps even don't see that in a tenant portal. They really just access the service through the browser web URL or database connection URL. Or you could do the other extreme, would be the VM gets deployed directly into a tenant org VDC, and the tenant gets more or less full console and network connection access to that virtual machine. And you as a provider sort of share the access and do the day two operations on the VM. But otherwise, from a networking connection and settings, it's up to the tenant to configure that and use that. And then there's some different levels of ways in between, where perhaps you could create one org VDC per tenant. So it's a separate org VDC within the tenant organization, but that's just used for managed service VMs, or again, VMs that run managed services that you as a provider control. So the tenant can see these virtual machines, but since they are separate, you would use some either shared org networks or cross org VDC networking, things like that, to connect them. But you get more flexibility when it comes to the different aspects of the org VDCs.
I guess if you're a service provider and you want to provide a kind of fairly self-service option here, then the org VDC for a tenant to kind of provision themselves, manage their own networking, their own security, their own firewall policies, and obviously the VMs that they want, the infrastructure they want, VMs and VApps. They'll then use those templates from a catalog that is available to them from the service provider. So the service provider can provide they're not only selling an org VDC, they're selling the application templates, the build templates, whatever they are, but also all of the networking components. Right, they'll be selling an edge firewall, edge load balancer function, distributed firewall potentially as well. But the tenant would then just be consuming and self-provisioning those assets, in fact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's one of the big benefits of having VCD as an underlying platform for that, because you have that choice as a service provider, that you
Yeah.
can offer services where you have tenants where well, these are very, let's say, tech-savvy tenants. They need a lot of different functionalities, but also they have the skills to manage them. So as a provider, I'm rather focusing on getting them the tools and the building blocks as in form of VM templates and a powerful service catalog that they can consume. And then on the other hand, the sort of other extreme, more or less, is where you as a service provider are expected to run and manage a complete service and just make it as simple as possible. And as a tenant user, I want to just get my WordPress installation, but I don't care about how that WordPress installation is backed up in background, how it's connected to the network, and what resources it actually consume. And with VCD, you can combine that either for different tenants or even within the same tenant. So that's a very powerful thing and a big differentiator of the Cloud Director platform compared to, for example, what a tenant could get from hyperscalers.
So I guess then, one of the things in consideration about which sort of service you would offer is obviously skills is a big one, right? Whether your tenant is capable of running their own org VDC. Secondly, though, I think portfolio. If you want to have third-party solutions that aren't multi-tenanted for any particular reason, customers got this, requirement, or you've got this great product that does something that you think you could sell, but it's not multi-tenanted. That's when you could potentially use the provider managed org VDC to kind of hide all of that tenancy issue and just provide them the service as well. So that might be some of the considerations to take up front in terms of what offering you're going to be putting to market.
Exactly. So that's one of the big design decisions that you can make for each managed service, is to decide if you want to have one virtual machine per instance of that service that a tenant runs, or if you can or want to create some shared services where you have one virtual machine that runs 10 or 20 or 100 different virtual hosts for a web server or a database server, for example, database instances. And the good thing, since we have all the platform built in the vSphere platform, we can run virtual machines, and with VCD, we can even keep a higher number of virtual machines with less effort under control and operate them pretty effortlessly. Even that option to have one virtual machine per instance still is a very valid option for managed services, especially if you have applications that do not provide any multi-tenancy out of the box, or it would be a big effort for you to make that multi-tenant within one system.
Yeah.
And since we are running VMs on a vSphere platform, and well, in VCD, in Cloud Director, you still can get scaling effects based on, I don't know, for example, using linked clones for certain types of instances, thin provisioning, different storage profiles, and of course in the org VDC, the different allocation models of the org VDC and the individual virtual machines, which are your configuration and different levels, and where you can define performance versus sharing and scaling effects and so on.
Yeah, sure.
And then we have the other aspects when it comes to the deployment on top. Well, we discussed already the network connection. So within an org VDC of the tenant, it's pretty easy to connect that service to other virtual machines. But VCD also provides you cross VDC networking, shared networking between different organization VDCs within the same organization and so on. So you have a lot of different options for that. And then for the resource allocation, well, that comes down to the allocation profiles of the org VDC. With the Flex model, you can combine different requirements for different levels of virtual machines within the same org VDC, and same for storage profiles as well.
Yeah. And now we have storage IOPS as well, right? So there's now IOPS control in 10.2.
Yeah, so that is coming as well. We already had that in past API only with some limitations, but that's something where we have some huge improvement in the future VCD release. Okay. Yeah, now that we as a provider designed the template and the preparation and the deployment of that managed service, now comes the big part, which is the actual operations of such a service offering. And that now covers a whole list of tasks that you typically have to do. Again, of course, the details for each of these tasks, they of course differ based on the service that you offer. So a database instance might be different, yeah, different complexity and have different details for each of these tasks when we compare that to an e-commerce or a web shop or a WordPress installation. But in general, it always fits into the same categories. And let's start bottom up here. First of all, is of course it's the security and isolation. When you want to create multi-tenant managed service, you have to somehow isolate the different tenants from each other. And well, with VCD, if you select that one VM per instance option, you get that for free because VCD takes care of the multi-tenancy. You just have to make sure that the VMs are being deployed in the right place in the right OrgVDC and connected to the right network. But if you do that as a provider, well, in the name or in the on behalf of a tenant with the tenant credentials, then VCD absolutely takes care, and you cannot even do something wrong because VCD just lets you access the stuff that belongs to that tenant.
Yeah.
Yeah, then the next thing is patches and upgrades. That's operating system and application security patches and major version upgrades. That, of course, heavily depends on the application itself. Mainly where comes in some breaking changes where you would need some changes in the application or in the consumption changes of I don't know, you have to check if WordPress plugins are still compatible with newer versions, things like that. For that, there is one aspect that I didn't note here, but comes in place as well. As a provider, you might want to offer some test environment for that, where we have, again, with the virtual machines and underlying vSphere platform, powerful options to just clone virtual machines. So, and with VCD, place them into a fenced, isolated network, for example, where you can offer to your tenant from a managed service, you just offer them a different instance, make the patch installation or the upgrade installation in a test environment first and let them test, and then give you some green checkbox. Okay, I tested my application, still works, so please proceed with upgrading the production environment.
And that's where things like VApps come in really handy, right? Because you can just simply copy the entire environment from one VApp to another environment, and you've got everything in there. You've got the self-contained networking, the VMs, the configurations, everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the very powerful aspect of Cloud Director.
Yeah.
And all of that, you don't have to automate that because that comes out of the box with VCD. So when you deploy a VApp and it has some defined VApp networks for or during the cloning or the deployment of that VApp, you just select if it should be connected to the rest of the network or if it should be an isolated network, but you still can keep all the identity of the virtual machines within the VApp network, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, then some other aspect that's more interesting typically for managed services for you as a provider is capacity planning. So when it comes to, I don't know, sizes, storage size, compute size of the virtual machine that runs the service, and especially over time when you grow that and you get either a single tenant consuming more and more instances of the service, or you get hopefully multiple more tenants consuming the same services, how you do the capacity planning of the underlying platform and the resources where they run. And then also related to that is, of course, the big monitoring aspect. So when you offer managed services, you have some typically defined some service level agreements that you want to offer to the tenant based on availability and performance guarantees that you give. And based on that, of course, you have to do well, the capacity planning and the placement of the virtual machine when it comes to availability, for example. But that's something typically you already have made the same SLA design process for the other OrgVDC offerings and the other service or more VM-focused infrastructure as a service offerings that you offer to your tenants.
Yeah, and I think that's a particularly important point, right? I mean, that's one of the big differentiators. You're going to have an SLA associated with availability and SLA associated with performance. And that for me is one of the largest differentiators between like hyperscale environments where those delays don't exist, or what. Also, the fact there's no one really to answer the phone when you have an issue. But these are things that are very much in control of either the tenant or the provider, depending on whether it's a self-serve or VDC or it's a managed virtual data center. The the performance ability, the ability to kind of remove noisy neighbors from the situation, and guarantee there won't be any noisy neighbors, and then performance with removal of hairpinning traffic and all sorts of improvements you can do there. I think those are huge core values for why a customer would come to a VCD, vSphere based or underlying fabric cloud provider.
Yeah, and for you as a cloud provider, even if the whole topic sounds a bit, well, perhaps challenging at the beginning, but it also means a big opportunity because you can define these service level agreements, and these are good options for you to differentiate from your competition and from hyperscalers, because you usually pretty good have a feeling about well, the stability and the availability of the underlying platform. And then when it comes to managed services, well, there are a lot of different options that you can offer on top of that to be proactive when it comes to availability monitoring. I don't know, again, for virtual machines that run a web shop or WordPress installation or something, you can monitor disk capacity inside the guest operating system, something that you would not care about for VMs that are completely managed by the tenant. But for managed services, of course, that's one aspect that could lead to some outages, for example, and then you can proactively monitor that. And the other aspect when it comes to availability is, of course, the time for recovery. If there is if there's really some outage for some reason, you as a provider have to decide, or can decide and figure out what you can offer or can guarantee the tenant how fast you can recover a service. And that, of course, goes into the overall availability aspect of the service level agreement as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, then the next topic we have is, of course, backup and restore. It's also related to that. That's something where you can, again, differentiate, use that as an option to provide more capabilities, for example, or different pricing set, different economy of scale if you have certain backup solutions in place already. And again, depending on the flavor or the application or the service that you want to offer, it might be good enough to just use what we already have. So if you have, again, a strategy for one VM per instance, per service instance, and you already have a backup as a service offering that allows tenants to back up their services or their virtual machines in a pure Org VDC and infrastructure as a service offering, then you can use the same solution also for these managed services VMs. Yeah. If you don't need the granularity, of course, if there is some application specific backup considerations to do, then that's a bit more work for you to put into the service design, but also, again, provides usually some more functionality for the tenant. And also be creative about that. We already talked about well, for test environments before major upgrades, for example, or even before patches, you want to offer some test environment, having backup and restore. Typically, the same process that you use to restore or to test a restore can be used to really create such a test environment, a separate test environment for your tenant. You might even spend some effort and make that into the service library so that the tenant can self-service, request a complete restore of a virtual machine or a service, or even, well, restore into a separate VApp, into an isolated VApp, because I want to do some testing, or it's part of the, well, the application development process that nothing in the infrastructure would change. I still use the same patch level. I still use the same application version, but now I want my application has some new version and I run some new logic in that and want to test that in a separate environment. So that's something as a tenant, I would be very happy if I get such a functionality, very easy to deploy test environments from the provider.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and then the next thing is about scaling for compute and storage, really of the individual services that you offer. That again comes down, well, with the monitoring, you know, capacity planning, you might be able to do some estimations and then give some way to either, well, scale up the service to just increase the capacity that this virtual machine has, for example, or be able to scale out, create some new instances, and well, use all the networking functionality of VCD with load balancing and so on to create some scale out functionality here.
I think this goes back to also the economies of scale, and another kind of big differentiator, depending what the offering is. If it's a multi-tenanted cloud, then you really want to make sure you're running your hardware to the appropriate level that you possibly can while providing a decent SLA. And scaling, you might have plenty of additional resource that's been hard assigned that isn't being used. It would depend on what sort of policies you're providing in your consumption models, whereas reservation or allocation or flex. But that scaling capability, obviously, providers want that economy of scale. They want that optimization, and I think one of the big differences here is it's the scaling of the virtualized resources, not of hosts. It's the scaling of the virtualized resources to meet the customer requirement without potential impact to new hosts. Looking at the performance and the capacity of the current infrastructure and being able to make use of that spare compute and memory resource on the actual physical hosts and extending VDCs fairly seamlessly into that infrastructure is really, really quite easy, and it's extreme flexibility, really, if you think about it. And having that as a capability to satisfy tenants' scaling requirements almost instantly is a huge differentiator.
Yeah, you mentioned, or we already discussed one example about the test environment for new applications or for new patches. If that's something where, as a tenant, you typically don't care about that much about the availability of these test systems, so you could, as a provider, again, easily reuse some old hardware, create some special provider VDCs or VDCs on top of that, and use that for provisioning these test environments for, and be able to offer that these resources as at a much cheaper price, for example.
Yeah.
So a lot of different option and flexibility in here.
Cool.
Yeah. And then the last point, of course, is the metering and billing, because eventually, as a service provider, you want to make some money out of these managed service offerings. And that's now something where, well, on the platform, you also can have a lot of different options how to design the pricing and the business model around managed service. And just to give you some examples of well, different partners and service providers that we work with, how they do this sort of due diligence when it comes to business model generation for the managed services. You are not at all limited to the same, well, just focus on scale like hyperscalers typically do. If you are a service provider and you work very closely with a certain customer, and it's or you have a very close relationship to your tenants, and you well, the tenant selects you as a provider because of that close relationship and because you can offer them what they need rather than just a pure pricing aspect of the service offering, then there might be something where you just well, offer them some additional functionality, but still keep the same existing billing model in the ArcVDC, and well, they then do not really pay for the open source based service, for example, but they really pay for the consumed resources in the same way as they pay for the other other VMs that they run, or just the ArcVDC that they pay for you, and you just consider that as a value add because you already have some comparable service offerings, and it's not additional effort for you as a provider, for example. So there are a lot of different options available here as well. And of course, well, the other thing is when it comes to usage meter and billing, you can also use the tools that the platform provides to really decide if you want to bill and charge based on resource consumption, if there are some special service related aspects in there, if it's based on the effort of well, non-standardized service offerings or operations that the tenant will ask you to do, some special patches to install, or some additional flexibility when it comes to supporting different application versions and so on. And there's again a lot of options here that you have as a service provider.
Yeah, I guess the whole kind of pricing and packaging conversation is a really complex one in terms of what services you're going to offer, the tiers of the services, and the underlying resources that are associated with those tiers. And when you're looking at the top layer here, the org VDC, that's it's fairly simple. It's black and white. It's you maybe got three different flavors of something, but the more you go down into the managed service, the more complicated that bill of materials is going to become. So you're kind of looking at, I think, when you look at these type of things, you're looking at a much more OpEx heavy at the bottom here, because you're providing that specialization, those skills to accommodate the customer's needs. It becomes a lot harder to try and price those things. That's where I think you kind of grow professional services businesses and start doing things like that. Whereas the further you are up to the North Star here, the org VDC self-service, the easier it becomes to kind of price and package those capabilities.
Yeah, and in addition to that, on the other hand, the more you go to that more provider managed side, if you again are in the business where you really act as a trusted partner for your end customers and the tenants, there might be even some ways where you rather do some project-based pricing and billing calculation, or that particular managed service for the web shop application or the web shop resources for this e-commerce site is just one small aspect of the overall service that you offer to that tenant, and you don't even need to separately bill or meter for that. It's just one, you can just calculate that as one part of the overall package for such an e-commerce solution, for example, which then again makes the whole discussion again very simple.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, to finalize now today the discussion that we had about the different aspects of managed services, let's now map all these different things to solutions and parts that we have in the platform. So that's not something for, I think, pretty much all of the different features and solutions we have. Some we demonstrated them in some other episodes, but just for you to get a feeling of what solutions can be used in, or what tools can be used in what of these different stages here. When it comes to template management, that's of course the area of the VMware Marketplace, Bitnami Marketplace, and other third-party solutions that you can subscribe to as a provider, and even more or less automatically can subscribe and publish these marketplace templates into your service catalog, which is a good building foundation for managed service offerings. Then for the actual deployment and this consumption, there's of course App Launchpad, which is not yet really designed for managed service offerings, but it still provides a very easy way for tenants to deploy applications. And again, if you are in a close relationship with your tenants and sort of can share with them root credentials to the deployed virtual machines and have a clear separation between what they should do and what you have to do as a provider to make that a managed service offering, then App Launchpad is an absolute valid solution that helps you for the deployment parts. And then of course we have all the VCD APIs and the clients or the users of these APIs, like the Terraform provider, that gives you a good way to define certain infrastructure pieces as code and deploy them programmatically as a provider. Or of course vRealize Orchestrator, which allows you to create some very simple additional services into the tenant portal, and then you can go as complex as you want in the underlying workflow to automate the processes.
Just to be clear, so when we're looking at the templates area, we've got templates in VCD, the catalogs. They're native; they've been around for a long time. And then we've got the marketplace sync with Bitnami, which is then something in 10.2 that you're going to be able to sync from VCD to Cloud Marketplace or the VMware Cloud Marketplace and pull down Bitnami applications. You can also pull down third-party applications, and you can also create your own custom applications with your custom workflow. So, you as a managed service provider, I think it's quite useful. You could, offer out applications to customers that are made for the customer through App Launchpad, or that the customer has today and wants to be able to provide to their tenants in a way that, the tenants don't need to know anything about the underlying infrastructure. They just want to kind of point and click at an application and, like a PaaS platform, they just want to deploy an app. They don't care about the underlying infrastructure. So there's multiple multiple ways of delivering that customized catalog of offerings at the moment, and it's with VCD 10.2, App Launchpad 2.0. I think there's a lot of new capability coming.
Yeah, and all that stuff, that these are not mutually exclusive, so you can always combine them for different organizations, different end customers, and have different flavors of the way you want to offer these managed services to your tenants. There might even be a way, if you have some really large tenant, where you can identify different user groups within the tenant that you collaborate, for example, with the more or less infrastructure team of the tenant, and work with them to provide templates that are then be placed in the VCD catalog. You as a service provider offer them through App Launchpad, and then you have a different group at the same tenant to consume these templates to build their applications on top of that. So that is another strategy or another idea where you just can get very creative as a service provider, again, to differentiate and to create a lot of stickiness with your tenants, and with that, of course, increase your business and increase your margins.
Yeah.
Yeah, then when it comes to the day two operations and the daily operational side of managed services, of course, that's where vRealize Operations and Tenant App comes in and can help you with things like capacity planning, service level definition and monitoring, scaling. We have the whole aspect of usage metering and billing, availability monitoring, and so on. So that's where with vRealize Operations you can create usually very easily can get a lot of value out of that for you as a provider for your day-to-day operations, to be, again, going back to the requirements, more efficient in your day-to-day operations. And you can offer some value add to the tenants when you publish certain reports, for example, into the provider portal, or just offer some specific alerts that are now not only alerts for, let's say, CPU utilization of a virtual machine, but really alerts of high latency for a web shop of the with the responses of that website or the web shop. Okay, yeah, so that's from my side for the discussion for the design, how to design some managed services as a Cloud Director provider partner.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, we've got obviously we're looking at availability, for example, and availability services. There's the Cloud Director availability, which will then provide the kind of DR capabilities as well, to underpin your infrastructure offering and to complement it. Yeah, it's great, York. I think you've pretty much covered all of the main pieces there, and driven into some of the detail around the decisions that really service providers have to make in presenting a service to a customer, and the type of capabilities that VCD has today. Like I said, there is a lot more coming in 10.2, especially in the kind of the marketplace, App Launchpad. Terraform is always catching up. As we build more and more objects into VCD, Terraform then kind of provides those in its releases as soon as we possibly can. And I guess the other kind of aspect here is that containers as infrastructure endpoints are becoming more and more a requirement for customers to have container cluster services, and that obviously fits into this model quite nicely. And a lot of the same things in terms of the managed service options or equally apply to it, don't they?
Yeah, if you think back about the episodes that we have for developer-ready cloud and container service extension, the
Mm.
whole idea of container service extension also is to give you these different options of rather you as a provider want to manage the whole Kubernetes cluster, for example, and just want to have the tenant consume individual containers from that, or if the different other flavor you as a provider want to offer the templates and the tenant then deploy the complete cluster into their org VDC and manage the complete cluster to get more flexibility what they have, and some different operational models. So all these things when it comes to containers, of course, apply, or all the thoughts apply to containers as well. If you think about that, and one additional step that we didn't cover today is currently, today's discussion, we focused on having managed services that run in virtual machines, and you have one virtual machine per instance as one possible deployment options. In future versions of App Launchpad, we of course will also support Helm charts and deploying Bitnami images based on Kubernetes clusters onto Kubernetes as a platform. And then that would be another dimension for that selection where you create security and isolation between your tenants compared to the different aspects of scale effects.
Yeah, I think the nice thing there is that whereas Kubernetes today with CSE is deployed into effectively VMs in Kubernetes clusters, with the vSphere support for Kubernetes natively, obviously that unit of consumption comes down to actually running Kubernetes clusters natively on vSphere, so no VMs required. But all the same the nice thing about this is all of the same operational capabilities are there because it's the underlying vSphere.
Yeah, it's a very powerful platform that again gives you as a provider even more options to differentiate and compete with the hyperscalers.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, listen, Jorg, thank you very much for today's session. It's been really informative to walk through all these different strategies and features and capabilities. So thank you very much.
Thanks.